Economic growth dominates the world agenda at the moment. Austerity is something that is beginning to diminish in importance. Frankly, austerity has never been seen to work in any economic regeneration. Infrastructure investment is regarded as being the engine of that growth. Throughout the world, governments are engaged primarily in infrastructure spending. Over the next 5 years, our estimate is that the world will spend, or try to spend, something like 6% of its GDP on average on infrastructure projects. Over the complete period, if you average the expenditure out, it comes to 4% of GDP. That represents an increase from the global average that has been spent of 3%. And that range is pretty large. As we just heard, here in Qatar, it's probably going to be about 9% of GDP. China is spending 9% of its GDP on infrastructure. The USA spends 2.4%. The UK, and indeed much of Western Europe, spends something around 1.3 to 1.5%. If infrastructure is the engine of growth, then if you underspend on it, your growth will diminish in comparison to those states that do spend larger amounts of money. What we see now in the economic situation is that it is not just a cyclical change, it is a discontinuity. And what will happen over the next 10 years will rebalance the world economy significantly, and infrastructure expenditure will play a very significant role in that. Our estimate is the additional funding that's required over the next 5 years, above and beyond what states have been able to finance and been able to provide, comes to $1.4 trillion per annum for each of the next 5 years. It's an enormous amount of money. 50% of those projects exceed $500 million. That represents something like 1,500 new large-scale, what are often called mega infrastructure projects throughout the world every year. It's an enormous number of projects. Can that be funded? Well, let's try and put this into context with the money. The World Economic Forum estimates that if the credit to GDP ratio is to be preserved over the next few years, to 2020, then the amount of credit in the world is going to have to virtually double. Now, what capacity remains, given the strains that are on the banking sector at the moment, what capacity remains to fund this additional infrastructure that's required? Well, one of the answers that's often given is it will come from institutional funding. If you look at that sector of the economy, then institutional funds are estimated to be 65 trillion throughout the world. They tend to allocate, on average, about 6% to infrastructure as an asset class. That's 4 trillion. If they were to actually absorb that $1.4 trillion that you saw on the previous slide, then our estimate is that they would need to allocate 11% of their assets. And we don't believe that's going to happen. The consequence of that will be that there is a severe strain and constraint on the funding of infrastructure projects. Not all of that $50 to $70 trillion will get financed and will become operable. There will be competition, there will be intense competition for it. Some people will not be able to get their projects off the ground. Other people will have to adopt non-traditional routes. The ways that infrastructure was financed previously, and that is before the 2008 financial crash, will not apply in the future. We have to think of different models. These mega projects, the ones over $500 million, suffer from something that we call optimism bias. We all know that they suffer from completion delays. We all know that they suffer from overspend. The Side Business School in Oxford has done some pretty groundbreaking work on this and says that mega projects, looking at the historical pattern of them, tend to overspend by 20 to 80%. Some of them overspend by a great deal more than that. That is a significant amount of money. That means that the $50 to $70 trillion that we spoke about before, if the Mega projects of that were done, it's going to approach possibly $100 trillion of financing requirement, if you include the contingency. If we can't finance the 50 to 70 out of traditional means, how can we finance the overspend? Many of these projects also suffer from underperformance. 30-year concessionary contracts for the utilization of assets to encourage financing, often the demand exceeds what is actually seen. There have been some spectacular examples where demand has been as low as 10 or 20% of that was envisaged when the particular project was instigated. These optimism bias features are a major problem. What's the context of this? There is insufficient funds to meet demand. Traditional finance models are inadequate. Project complexity is growing. It's the question we spoke about before about complex projects. Mega projects aren't getting simpler. They're becoming more complex, and it's been shown by research by the Rand Institute and other places that one of the key features of why projects seem to go wrong is that they have technological novelty within them, and that novelty represents a higher category of risk, and we don't know how to handle it. The risk of overspend is unacceptable. You can measure the overspend on infrastructure projects in the number of schools and hospitals that could be built, that won't be built because the other projects have consumed all the funds. Our social infrastructure suffers as a consequence of our inability to manage properly and understand the dynamics of our economic infrastructure expenditure. Conventional project management is flawed. That's a very provocative statement. But what we do know is that when we look at construction projects, we can do those very well. Project management in construction projects is excellent. We can build things without a problem. The problems arise when we combine that technological innovation that I spoke about before with construction. At the edge of that is where the problems arise. Projects tend to go wrong mostly within the 18 months to 2 years before they become operational. That is where the highest risk occurs. Most structured finance and project finance has a tendency to look at the construction phase of a project as being a pattern of diminishing risk. It isn't. We've seen from our research to date that the risk elevates when the construction process is coming to an end, and other aspects that take an asset and make it capable of operating have to be applied. It's a new area, it's a novel area. Previously, construction was what projects were all about. Build it and you could operate it. Nowadays, you cannot do that. Why did we choose to, or decide that it was appropriate to establish a think tank? Infrastructure investment is transformative. That's why everyone wants to do it. Nation states throughout the world want to do it. There is no economic policy agenda that competes with it. It transforms economies. There is evidence that it does so if infrastructure investment is managed correctly. It dominates economic policy. It's dominating it throughout the world. Every economist, every institute that deals with economics, every government, every politician talks about the transformative value of infrastructure, and they want more of it. You heard Boris Johnson speak about it in London. A mature city. It realizes that for it to participate in the next generation of economic activity, it needs to not only refurbish its existing infrastructure, it needs to build new infrastructure. We can see it here in Doha, that the reinvestment of its hydrocarbon income to create a vibrant alternative structure of economy in the future is why there is such an enormous investment here, both in Doha and in the GCC region as a whole. It is transformative. But there are inherent problems with mega projects, and these need to be understood and resolved. The gentleman, when he asked the question about whether we'd moved beyond study and we were into the practical application of this, of course, in part he's right, but what I would say to you, and it is the foundation of why we launched the Institute, is that we don't understand what happens in that post-construction phase And that is where all the risks take place. And we frankly don't understand that. It's a new area of infrastructure development where we've learnt about it over the last 10 to 20 years, but we haven't got the answers yet. No one has. It's where the risk takes place, it's where the problems occur. The purpose of the Institute is not to go back and look at a new way of building buildings and building roads, the construction elements of it. People can do that and do that very well. It's what happens when those assets are nearing completion and new things happen when we have to put in computer systems, we have to understand the processes of how people interact with the assets. That is the point at which these things go wrong. We need pragmatic and innovative thinking. It's vital. This speaks to the point that we're not just going to research things for the sake of producing academic papers. We're looking for the practical application, the understanding of why these things don't work, how they can work better, and the practical application of that. This is the essence of what the Institute is about. It's about practice, it's not about academic research and writing theoretical papers on things. The Institute is born out of our practical application, our practical experience of managing these infrastructure projects, dealing with them when they've gone wrong, the most complicated kinds of them. We have our expertise, a lot of our expertise is born of airports and other transportation systems. They're the most complex of them all. Nations that get this right will prosper. Those that don't will fall behind. The Institute intends to be at the forefront of this innovative thinking. We intend to do that globally. We think this is a global problem. These projects don't go wrong in a particular region. They don't go wrong in a particular sector. The new thinking, the new investment is not confined either geographically or in a region. It happens globally. It's a global problem. It requires a global solution. It requires thinking that has a global reach to it. These are the initial projects that the Institute has started to work on. We've talked a little bit about why mega projects are delivered late and over budget. That is crucial. The reliance of PPP to large complex programs and the rise of new funding structures. PPP is important, but quite frankly, if you're going to look at a PPP structure that simply transfers the risk out of the public sector into the private sector, it's not a partnership at that point. It's a supplier-contractor relationship. To call it one thing, to call it a partnership is fine, but it isn't. There has to be much more of a risk-sharing, risk participation arrangement in it. Too many people have looked at PPP structures as access to an alternative form of funding and just to move the risk out of the public sector into the private sector. It doesn't work. It hasn't worked. The risk of these large infrastructure projects worldwide resides always with the state in which they are built. The state becomes the funder of last resort. You'd never transfer the whole of the risk into the private sector. Dark risk is something that I think is very important. If you look at the Berlin-Brandenburg airport, then you'll find that 1 month before it was scheduled to open, in June of last year, they found sufficient unidentified risks and problems in the project 1 month before it was due to open to delay it until 2013, October 2013, and an extra cost of 1.2 billion euros. When that cost was approved by the European Competition Commission in December last year, they then discovered that it was inadequate, it was insufficient, and it wouldn't open in October 13, but it would open sometime in 2014. No specific date mentioned. My point about this is as follows, that here we were 1 month before the airport was due to open, with tickets sold for flights to come into it, and the government of Germany discovered at that point that the airport could not be open, not just for a year, but almost 2 years. This is dark risk. Nobody saw that risk. Nobody looked for it. Of course it was there. It's vitally important that on all these projects, this dark risk is recognised. Problem with airports, are they viable or just necessary? Airports are a major investment that people have. Just about every state in the world is looking for an airport as being the prime mover of its economy. Are they viable? Margins in airport operations and aviation today are very small. They don't work entirely in the private sector. The amount of airport capacity that's being put down exceeds the amount of traffic that there is in the world. That will push down the profitability of these airports. If they are the primary engine of growth, international growth in an economy, they have to be subsidized by the state. They cannot be operated on the basis of concessions over a long period without the state participating in them. Will the Middle East consume the majority of global funds for the infrastructure asset class? The answer is probably yes. It's got a good credit rating, better than many other places that would like to invest in infrastructure and attract those funds. It's also, from the point of view of the market, as we heard from our speakers earlier, it's a safe haven. It has low political risk. It's a safe haven for those funds. We estimate that probably there is only capacity for about 50% funding of the infrastructure that's proposed around the world. Consequence of that is the funds will flow to the places that's most creditworthy, the places likely to deliver those assets with the lowest point of default, and the Middle East will represent that. So the funds will flow in this direction. The final thing that we're working on is, can infrastructure expenditure still stimulate economic growth? Is the theory behind it that infrastructure spending is the way to growth still valid? The argument is that perhaps it's diminishing in its value over time. We have to understand the degree to that if we're going to deal with this problem of underperformance of the assets. We have to understand how it will deliver economic growth to economies. It isn't just as simple as build something big and dominant in the economy and it will set the wheel in motion and will deliver economic growth. We have to understand that much better than we have over the last 20 or 30 years. My little device seems to have stopped working. So, it's going to be a journey for us at the Institute. We have a lot of work to do, and we hope very much that you that are here today and other people, both in London and elsewhere in the GCC region, are going to share that journey with us. Thank you.